They kicked me out on my graduation night and said I'd never amount to anything. 11 years later, I walked into my sister's wedding. Her husband stared at me and asked, "You two know each other?" I smiled. "Too well." I can still feel the sting of that sentence, sharp enough to split the person I was from the woman I'd have to become. I left that night with a single worn suitcase, a silk dress soaked through by the May rain, and a single promise whispered into the dark. Survive first. Rise later. That promise was the only weight I carried for over a decade, the only thing that forced me to put one foot in front of the other. My childhood was not the warm, sunny place most people talk about. It was more like a long, narrow hallway, cold and echoing, lined with doors that only ever seemed to open for my younger sister, Grace. If you grow up as the responsible one, the quiet helper, you learn the script by heart. I learned early that being quiet kept the peace, that stepping aside kept the household running smoothly, and that the love in our home came with conditions printed so small you did not notice them until you failed to meet one. My father, Rowan, ran the family medical clinic in the city. He carried himself like every opinion he held was an absolute, medically backed fact. My mother, Elaine, was his mirror. She repeated his beliefs as gospel and dedicated her life to maintaining the family's professional image and social facade. And then there was Grace. Grace learned early that being the family favorite was a full-time position that required constant performance. She played the part beautifully, the soft voice, the wide, appealing eyes, and a remarkable talent for looking utterly helpless at exactly the moment the attention needed to shift to her. I remember watching them from the shadows of the doorway when I was a teenager. My father would lean over Grace's homework, offering complex explanations, while my mother fussed with Grace's hair before a dance recital. I would stand there, my backpack still slung over my shoulder, holding the straight A report cards they never once asked to see. You tell yourself you do not care. You tell yourself fairness is a luxury you cannot afford. But the cracks form quietly, long before the structure ever breaks. Even then, I worked constantly. I took after-school shifts and weekend jobs, saving every penny. I counted my earnings in a small, battered tin box hidden under my bed, counting it as my future, my way out. When my college acceptance letter arrived, I did not show it to them. I cried alone in the parking lot behind the grocery store where I stocked shelves. A few months later, when Grace received her acceptance to a prestigious, distant university, the difference was immediate and jarring. Grace got balloons, an expensive cake, and a formal family dinner that went on for hours. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that getting out was the only luxury I truly needed. Even came into my life years later. When I was working the night desk at a busy city hospital and studying furiously between checking patient charts and managing administrative work. He was a resident then. Sharp-witted and kind, always noticing when I hadn't eaten or when I had fallen asleep with my head resting on my notes. He did not ask about my family at first. Maybe sensing that the truth lived behind a locked, armored door. After college and medical school, I went on to finish my residency and eventually started my own successful clinical psychology practice. Liam came after that, a miracle wrapped in sticky fingers and noisy laughter, a constant, vivid reminder that I could build something whole and better than what I had come from. For a long time, I avoided anything that carried the name Heart. I refused to look at family photos. I ignored holiday gatherings. I would drive 3 extra miles, just to avoid the city block where their clinic sat. But the invitation to Grace's wedding changed everything. The thick, creamy envelope held a weight I could ignore, a quiet challenge I realized I was finally strong enough to meet. Deep down, I knew walking into that brightly lit ballroom meant finally opening the door I had kept shut for over a decade, and I was not afraid of what would walk out. The moment I opened the engraved invitation, 11 years of carefully constructed walls felt like they were only paper, thin. I held the card, turning it over and over, feeling the thick, creamy stalk, a perfect symbol of the lavish life Grace had always known. The envelope was sealed with a precise golden wax emblem of the Hart family crest, a symbol that had once felt like a brand, and now felt like a meaningless piece of theater. The invitation was addressed to Dr. and Mr. Evan Marshall, and guest. They had not even bothered to use my current last name, simply referring to me by my old professional title and my partner's name. It was the deepest form of erasure, and yet, they had needed to invite me to maintain the veneer of a perfect family. "Are you sure about this, Alice?" Evan's voice was warm, steady, pulling me back from the precipice of the past. He was folding laundry on the sofa, a mundane, beautiful domestic scene that starkly contrasted with the emotional war I was about to walk into. "We don't have to go. We can call in sick." I walked over and kissed the line of worry between his brows. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I need to go. I need to see the ballroom. I need to close the door myself." My need was not for revenge. It was for the quiet certainty of my own reality. I needed the person I was now to stand in the place where the person I was then had been destroyed. We dressed carefully. Evan looked effortlessly handsome in a dark suit, his calm demeanor already serving as my anchor. Liam, our 7-year-old son, was delighted to be wearing a tiny tuxedo, all excitement over the promise of towering cake. He was my innocence, a shield of pure, uncomplicated love. We drove the 40 miles to the city, past the old clinic and the neighborhoods I had consciously avoided for over a decade. The venue was exactly what I had expected. A downtown hotel ballroom. All soaring ceilings, marble floors, and chandeliers that threw a dizzying, gilded light onto the scene. If the Pat had a temperature, that ballroom felt exactly like it, too bright, too polished, and too eager to pretend nothing uncomfortable had ever happened. We stopped just inside the main entrance. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling Evan's reassuring hand settle firmly on the small of my back. Liam clutched my hand tightly, craning his neck to take in the elaborate display. "Mom, do we know anyone here?" he whispered, his voice hushed by the grandeur of the room. I squeezed his fingers. "Only a few," I murmured. "Only ghosts," I thought. Ghosts I needed to lay to rest. We stepped forward, moving past the receiving line. The polite, measured murmur of conversation did not stop, but it shifted, subtly, like curtains catching a draft. Faces turned, eyes widened. It was not a loud, dramatic stop, but a spreading wave of quiet recognition. Alice Hart. The name that should never have appeared on the seating chart. A few doctors, associates I knew vaguely from city conferences, or from my own professional orbit. I paused mid-sentence when they spotted my name on the place cards near the entrance, then glanced at my face. I was accustomed to that reaction in my professional life, the recognition of my clinical success. But not here. Not at a wedding where my own family had once sworn I would never be more than a failure. My doctorate, my success, my life, felt like an uninvited guest. The air was already tightening, waiting for something to break, and I felt a curious lack of fear. I was not that 18-year-old girl anymore. I was ready. I saw her face across the room, and for a split second, she wasn't the bride. She was the girl who always looked at me with calculation. Grace appeared first, gliding toward us from the head table. Her white gown shimmered under the ballroom lights, a vision of bridal perfection. But her face was a disaster. The moment she fully registered my presence, her expression went through a rapid cycles. Surprise melting into immediate, icy calculation, which then hardened quickly into raw panic. Her shoulders tensed beneath the expensive lace, and the smile she tried to force wobbled like a poorly tied ribbon. "Elise," she breathed, the name coming out as a strangled accusation. As if merely speaking it might summon a reckoning, she was desperately unprepared to face. Behind her, my parents froze instantly. My father, Rowan, usually so composed, had his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching near his ear. My mother, Elaine, instinctively raised a hand to her necklace, a nervous gesture she always used when caught completely off guard. As though clutching pearls could somehow rewrite history and make me disappear. My mother's voice, usually pitched for social pleasantries, was a sharp, frantic whisper. "Why? Why are you here?" she demanded. I lifted the corner of the invitation slightly, just enough for them to see the paper. "I was invited," I replied simply. There was no apology in my voice, no hesitation. I spoke as the successful woman I had become, demanding the basic respect of the truth. Before they could scramble to find a coherent response, movement stirred beside Grace. A man stepped forward, the groom, Daniel West. He was broad-shouldered and impeccably polished, carrying the kind of poised, analytical confidence that comes from years of rigorous medical training. He studied me with the calm, methodical assessment of someone trained to read subtle cues under high pressure. His gaze flicked from my face, taking in my dress and my confident posture, to the small name badge clipped discreetly to my clutch. Something immediately sharpened in his eyes. He saw the title, Dr. Alice Hart. He saw the tension in his bride's shoulders, the terror in his in-laws' faces, and the unflinching calmness in mine. "You two know each other?" Daniel asked, the question hanging in the air, deceptively neutral but striking a silent chord of profound realization through the whole room. He glanced between me and the family, who suddenly looked like they were standing on a surface of cracking ice. Grace went absolutely stiff. My parents blanched, their carefully composed masks falling away entirely. Guests nearby slowed their steps, pretending to admire the flowers, while their ears strained to catch the drama. The air tightened, heavy and pressurized, waiting for a definitive answer. I felt the familiar, old ache tug at my ribs. The memory of the rain. The sound of the door slamming. The vicious words that had carved themselves into me the night they drove me out. But beneath that ache, there was something else now. Something steady and far stronger. The calm resilience of the woman who had built her success with her own two hands. Daniel was waiting. Grace was desperate. Rowan was furious. It was the moment I chose to fully embrace the power I now held. I smiled. It was a perfect, steady smile. But I allowed my eyes to hold 1,000 unspoken truths. "Too well," I replied. Daniel blinked, confused by the cryptic answer and the raw fear it sparked in his bride. In that tiny hesitation, I saw the first critical thread of their carefully woven lie unravel. Grace's fingers tightened and knotted in the fabric of her pristine gown. My mother's lips parted, like she wanted to intervene, but she realized she had no script prepared for this particular moment, no polite social maneuver to deploy. Evan leaned closer, his warm breath a steady comfort against my ear. "You okay?" he murmured, ready to pull me out if I needed it. "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time in over 11 years, standing right there in the heart of their performance, it was absolutely true. Because I could feel the energy shifting. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but quiet and inevitable, like the immense pressure building beneath a sheet of glass, just before it shatters. I knew, with a calm certainty, that this was only the very beginning. My smile had been the first crack, and Daniel, the rational doctor, was sharp enough to start pulling the threads loose. Grace tried to recover first. She forced out a shaky, high-pitched laugh, the kind she used to use on teachers when she hadn't done the assigned reading. "We just haven't seen each other in ages," she said, reaching for Daniel's arm, clinging to him like she needed an anchor to keep her from drifting away. Daniel did not lean into her touch. Instead, he kept his thoughtful gaze fixed on me, the analytical curiosity in his eyes making Grace visibly more uneasy. He was trained to find the anomaly, The break in the pattern, and I was clearly it. "Your last name is Hart," he said, speaking slowly, thoughtfully. "So is hers. But she never mentioned you. Not once. She doesn't like talking about the past." My mother cut in sharply, her voice fluttering high and brittle. "Today is a happy day. Let's focus on that, Daniel." But her voice was trembling, and Daniel, who was professionally accustomed to reading people under immense stress, noticed it instantly. He turned to Grace again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Why didn't you tell me you had an older sister, Grace?" Grace opened her mouth, closed it, and opened it again. It just never came up." The weak, flimsy answer hung between them like a cloud of smoke, suffocating the joyous atmosphere of the wedding. Evan squeezed my hand again, a quiet vote of confidence. A few nearby guests, mostly family friends and medical colleagues, stopped pretending not to listen altogether. I didn't need to pursue revenge. The simple, unadorned truth was doing the work for me. A server passed by with a tray of iced champagne flutes. I reached out and took one, letting the sharp, cold condensation settle into my fingers. I watched the three of them, my sister, my mother, my father, shuffling under the immense weight of a story they had successfully buried for more than 10 years. Finally, Rowan stepped forward, positioning himself physically between Daniel and me. "Alice," he said in a low, furious voice meant only for me, but too brittle to stay contained. "I don't know what you are trying to do, but this is not the place. You will not cause a scene." That old, ingrained instinct, the one that used to make me shrink, apologize, and fold myself smaller, flickered violently for a moment, then died completely. "I am not trying to do anything," I said, meeting his hard glare calmly. "I am simply attending the wedding I was invited to." For a second, his face was so red I thought he might explode into full, unrestrained anger. Then he caught Daniel watching him, recalibrated instantly, and forced a smile so tight it looked painful and deeply unnatural. "Let's all take a breath," Daniel said carefully, attempting to regain control of his own wedding reception. "I'm just surprised. Grace told me that she handled the family clinic alone for years, that my in-laws depended on her, and that she was the only one who stayed behind to keep everything running smoothly." My eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch. I didn't need to say a word. "Is that what she said?" I asked softly, directing the question to the room at large. Grace visibly paled, shrinking away from her own husband. The room seemed to tilt slightly around us, conversation stalling again. Tiny changes in posture, glances exchanged, and whispers began to form among the listening guests. Evan's practiced calm beside me became a warm, grounding force I relied on. Liam tugged my dress, his small, worried face looking up at me. "Mom." "Soon, sweetie," I whispered, kneeling quickly to reassure him, pulling myself back to the present. Grace stepped closer, her voice lowered to a harsh, desperate hiss meant only for my ears. "Why are you doing this? Why show up now, today?" "I didn't know I needed your permission," I replied, my voice just as low, just as firm. Her eyes were pulled wide with pure panic, not guilt. The raw panic a person feels when their carefully constructed facade is slipping and there's nothing left, absolutely nothing, to hold on to. Moments later, she turned and disappeared rapidly into the hallway leading to the restrooms, her high heels clicking too fast, too frantically, for a radiant bride. Elaine hurried after her. Rowan lingered, glaring at me like I had reached out and snapped the life he had constructed for Grace with my bare hands. But all I had done was walk in the door. Evan nudged me gently. "She's unraveling," he murmured. "No," I said, watching the hallway entrance. "She's revealing." And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was no longer the drenched 18-year-old girl begging them to believe her. I was the one they should have feared losing. I walked toward the hallway entrance, leaving the polite, suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom behind. I c- My heels clicked steadily on the marble floor, a rhythm of quiet determination that felt nothing like the panicked retreat of my sister. I knew this confrontation was necessary, not for Daniel or the family's reputation, but for the 18-year-old girl who had been thrown out into the rain. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking validation that my memory of that night was true and real. I found Grace in the restroom hallway, an isolated, quiet space. She was gripping the edge of the marble counter with white knuckles, staring at her reflection as if the mirror held an enemy. Her face looked brittle, eyes too wide, breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. The panic was raw and absolute, the kind she couldn't hide with charm or her expensive white makeup. The music from the ballroom drifted in softly, a romantic, out-of-place melody that seemed to mock the scene of utter despair. When she heard my steps, her shoulders snapped back instantly, the pride of the golden child resurfacing momentarily. "You had no right to come here," she whispered, her voice frayed at the edges. "I was invited," I replied, standing a short distance away. "By your husband." Her jaw tightened. "Daniel doesn't know everything. I am starting to realize that," I responded. For a long moment, neither of us moved. We simply stood there. Two women separated by 11 years of lies and a shared history of conditional love. Grace finally spat out her core resentment. "Why now? Why today? You couldn't let me have this one moment." "I didn't come here to ruin anything," I said quietly, the truth settling between us. "I just showed up. The rest, that's yours." Her eyes flashed with anger, but beneath the hostility was something far more potent, pure, crippling fear. "He can't find out," she whispered, taking a stumbling step toward me. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I corrected her, the words measured and calm. She flinched violently. And I did understand. I understood the years of manipulation, the narrative she had told everyone that I had dropped out, that I was unstable, that she had been forced to carry the family's professional burdens alone. All of this, while living off the opportunities and reputation bought with my stolen effort, and the successful life I had built despite their efforts. "Grace," I said, my voice low. "You can't build an entire life on a version of me that never existed. It will collapse eventually." She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in tight. "Please, Alice. Please don't say anything else out there." I removed her hand gently, releasing myself from her desperate grip. "I haven't said a single word," I reminded her. That was the part that truly terrified her. I did not need to speak. She was tearing her world apart herself, simply trying to keep up with the lies. As her panic continued to build, the real, ugly confession finally surfaced, shaking her entire body. "If I didn't," she stammered, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks, ruining her careful makeup, "they would have looked at her. Not me. You don't know what it was like." Her voice cracked entirely, the last vestiges of her anger dissolving into total breakdown. "She's always been smarter," Grace whispered, defeated. "Always. Everyone favored her. Favored me," I repeated, my voice softening as the immense, bitter irony hit me. "Grace, they threw me out. They told me I was nothing." The ultimate truth, the painful core memory she had erased from the public record, was now acknowledged between us. Not publicly, but intimately, between the two people who remembered the reality of that night. I was not angry anymore. I was simply released from the burden of carrying that memory alone. When I turned to walk back to the ballroom, I felt a calm clarity. I was no longer the exiled failure of her memory. I was the undeniable, successful proof of her envy and their malice. When we returned to the ballroom, I could feel the atmosphere was no longer polite, it was waiting. The absence of Grace and my mother had only intensified the scrutiny. Conversations faltered, and heads turned when I walked back to our table. Rowan stood near the head table, whispering urgently to Daniel, who looked increasingly troubled, his composure visibly cracking around the edges. Evan walked toward me, Liam perched comfortably on his hip. People are asking questions, Evan murmured. His voice low and professional. Mostly about the clinic, and why they haven't seen you in years. Let them, I said. My heart felt steady, almost cold. I knew the truth was already airborne. We returned to our table just in time to hear a distinguished doctor, a friend of Daniel's from one of the major city hospitals, greet Daniel warmly. Then, he turned to Grace, who had been ushered back out by my mother, looking composed but fragile. "Ah, Grace," the doctor said pleasantly. "You worked at your family's clinic for how many years again?" Grace straightened, managing to force out a bright, if desperate, smile. "Oh, I've been managing everything since college. A full-time position, helping my parents." The doctor nodded politely, but his expression held a flicker of curiosity. "And where did you study again?" I remember Daniel mentioning Stanford. Grace cut in quickly, her voice too high. "I completed a specialized track. A kind of administrative focus." The doctor paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Really? That's interesting." "I collaborated with faculty there for 5 years, specifically on health systems administration. I don't recall that particular program being offered." The silence that followed was immediate, crushing. Daniel stiffened beside her, his analytical mind clearly registering the precise nature of the lie. The general polite murmuring of the reception instantly died, concentrating the focus onto the head table. I felt the moment the thread of Grace's fabrication snapped. Daniel turned to his bride, slowly, deliberately. His voice was no longer that of a confused groom, but of a rationalist seeking absolute, verifiable data. "Grace," he said. "Which professors supervised your program?" Grace's lips parted soundlessly. Rowan, seeing the catastrophic collapse, jumped in, his voice loud and rough. "This is ridiculous. Today is supposed to be about joy and celebration. This has nothing to do with. Let's not do this here." "Rowan?" Elaine placed a trembling hand on his arm, her eyes wide with terror. But Daniel was no longer listening to them. His attention was locked on his bride, and his gaze was utterly unforgiving. He murmured, the 2 words sounding like a final verdict. "Did you ever even attend Stanford?" Grace's breath hitched. A tiny, broken sound. The room fell into a hush so profound it felt like the very gravity of the moment had shifted. I did not step forward. I did not interrupt. I simply watched, the same way a forensic witness watches a building sway before it collapses entirely under its own faulty structural beams. Daniel exhaled sharply, pushing his tuxedo jacket back with a precise, clinical movement. "Grace, who is she really?" He nodded toward me. "You said she was unstable. You said she cut the family off. You said I had to." Grace broke in, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush of self-pity and fear. "If I didn't, they would have looked at her, not me. You don't know what it was like." Favored me. I repeated softly, unable to stop the gentle, damning contradiction. "Grace." They threw me out. There it was. The truth she had never wanted acknowledged. Not publicly, not with 100 witnesses who would remember every single word. Rowan stormed forward, his face contorted. "Enough, Alice! You will not take attention from your sister's day." I met his furious glare calmly. "I'm not the one taking attention," I replied. Daniel faced his father-in-law, his voice quiet but steady. "Is it true, Rowan? Did you kick her out on graduation night?" Rowan's nostrils flared, his control failing completely. "She was ungrateful. She refused to help at the clinic. She didn't have the discipline to handle the practice's finances." "That's not what you told me." Daniel cut him off, his voice ice cold. "You said she left because she couldn't handle responsibility. You said she was an emotional drain on the practice." Grace squeezed her eyes shut, a defeated whimper escaping her lips. I felt my own pulse steady. This was not revenge. This was simply revelation, delivered by the people who had tried so desperately to bury it. And it was still not finished. I didn't need to speak again. The truth, once released, was now moving on its own, powered by Daniel's analytical need for honesty. In fact, Daniel continued, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the ballroom. Addressing Rowan directly. The early records from your clinic don't align with what Grace has told me about her role. She claimed she was managing administrative systems while in college, running the entire office. Yet, the old training logs and the billing correspondences from that time list her only as a part-time receptionist, nothing more. My mother, Elaine, pressed a hand to her forehead. Rowan took a shaky, defensive step back. Just like that, the entire structure they had built, the professional narrative they had depended upon for over 11 years, began to crumble, not under my attack, but under Daniel's objective scrutiny. And you? Daniel turned his gaze toward me, his expression complex, a mixture of professional curiosity and personal devastation. Your name appears repeatedly on the early administrative systems and initial training logs, right before the entire system was supposedly revamped. Why would Alice's name be listed there as the system's architect and primary administrator, if not Grace's? I held his gaze steadily. Because I used to help run the place? I confirmed. I built the initial patient tracking system and managed the staff training for 3 years before I left. Grace let out a sharp, choked breath. I didn't think you'd remember those specific details. She whispered, the last of her fight draining away. I remember everything, I said. My voice utterly devoid of anger, containing only the quiet, immutable weight of fact. And that simple, factual truth drew every single eye in the crowded room. Daniel looked utterly devastated, his wedding day collapsing around him. Why would you hide this from me, Grace? I didn't want to lose you, she wailed, tears spilling down her cheeks, heedless of the watching crowd. You lost me the moment you lied, he said. He stepped away from her, just a few inches. But the distance was immense, an absolute separation that everyone present saw and instantly understood. A tremor of hushed whispers rippled through the guests. Liam tugged insistently on my hand, scared by the loud voices and the universal distress. Mom, are you mad at that lady? I knelt down quickly, pulling him close for a moment. Nobody is mad, sweetie, I whispered, holding him tight. Just sad. People shouldn't lie. He nodded solemnly, accepting the gravity of that simple moral truth. Daniel approached me slowly, the successful doctor now stripped bare by the revelation of his bride's deceit. Elise, he said, his voice low but firm. How much of what they told me about you was false? Most of it, I answered honestly. Rowan lunged forward, the desperate instinct of a cornered man taking over. Don't listen to this? She's trying to destroy. He didn't finish the sentence. A man in a crisp gray suit, who had been standing discreetly near the entrance for several minutes, stepped calmly into the main reception area. He was one of the quiet, professional figures from the investigator's office, the man who had been tracking the financial inconsistencies I had quietly reported months earlier, only after ensuring my own clinical practice was completely secure and above reproach. The sight of him made Rowan go rigid. Elaine swayed slightly, clutching Daniel's arm for support. Grace let out a small, broken sound. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't smile. Justice, I realized, doesn't always arrive loudly with thunder and shouting. Sometimes it simply walks in the door and stands there, quietly, long enough for the guilty parties to recognize themselves and the inescapable consequences of their actions. Rowan swallowed hard, his face a mask of sweat and panic. This is a private event, he managed to choke out. The investigator spoke calmly, his tone strictly professional and devoid of judgment. I won't disrupt the reception. Further, I am here only to deliver documents regarding the clinic's current billing and operational practices. They should be reviewed promptly. He held out a thick manila envelope. No one, Not Rowan, not Elaine, and certainly not Grace, dared to reach for it. Finally, I did. I stepped forward, took the envelope briefly, and then handed it directly to Rowan. "You should open this," I said softly. The room was so utterly quiet I could hear the fragile tremor of the paper as he reluctantly took it. Evan stepped immediately beside me, his presence a warm, solid, and undeniable grounding force. Liam leaned into my legs, sensing the tension, but protected by our immediate circle. Daniel looked at me with something like respect. Softened by regret and sharpened by the brutal certainty of the truth. Grace simply collapsed into a nearby velvet chair, her pristine, white gown pooling around her, like a fallen curtain, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the life she had built on borrowed pieces. I didn't feel victory or triumph. I felt only an immense, profound release. Daniel exhaled once more, the sound of a man letting go of a deeply held falsehood. "You two know each other," he whispered again, the same words he had asked at the start of the reception, but now laden with a devastatingly different, final meaning. I smiled gently, my true smile this time. "Too well," I confirmed. And this time, every single person in the room understood exactly what that meant. The wedding ended in a silence no music could repair. The quiet was not awkward or tense. For me, it was a vast, peaceful relief. Guests drifted out, their voices hushed, casting sideways glances that held equal parts sympathy for me and profound disbelief regarding my family. The illusion was broken, thoroughly and publicly. Evan drove us home. His hand rested warmly over mine on the center console, grounding me in a way my biological family never had, tethering me to the strong, real future we had built together. Liam fell asleep in the back seat, his small breath steady and utterly untroubled, oblivious to the emotional warfare he had just witnessed. By the next morning, the clinic investigation had escalated significantly. I did not push it forward. I did not call the investigator or volunteer unnecessary information. I simply and truthfully responded to every official request for old records and billing correspondences from my time there. I provided nothing more than the cold, hard facts they had once tried to force me to carry alone. The full legal and professional consequences now belonged entirely to Rowan, Elaine, and Grace. That was their burden to carry. A week later, Daniel reached out to me. Not for drama, not for pity, but for closure. He was professional, concise, and profoundly apologetic for believing the malicious version of me he had been fed by his wife and in-laws. I accepted his apology, not because he entirely deserved my forgiveness, but because I realized I no longer needed anything from the past. Not even the satisfaction of denying him my peace. I wished him well and disconnected the call, closing that final connection without lingering regret. Life settled into something gentler, brighter. My home office felt lighter. The burden of the secret lifted entirely. The early December sunlight seemed to catch the dust motes in a more beautiful, less anxious way. Evan and Liam spent the next few weekends meticulously building model rockets on the patio, their laughter loud and reassuring. While they worked, I reviewed proposals for a new scholarship fund I was creating. It was designed specifically for first-generation professional students who, like me, had talent and drive but no safety net, no family capital, and no one to vouch for them. It was a tangible way to forge constructive power from that painful, destructive past. I didn't forgive my family, nor did I hate them. I simply allowed them to become what they had always been, a closed, toxic chapter that I had finally, permanently outgrown. They were irrelevant to the success and happiness of my present. Sometimes, justice is not a loud, crashing verdict or a grand, sweeping act of revenge. Sometimes it is the quiet, unbreakable certainty that you walked away whole, intact, and successful, while the truth, the inevitable, patient truth, finally caught up to the people who had tried so desperately to break you. I had built a life they could not touch, a family they could not rewrite, and a future that belonged only to us, free from their shadow. That was a victory more profound than any public scene.